سلام تغطات نايس channel كمي كان يخون كمي تخونو حجي حنتا قد عسيت فيديو لايف ناتا قبرت كلا قلق كفالنا تاكا قرب لكم كفتني بزعبا إثيوبيا زملكت تي بايتون أمريكا أقد عسي حبريتا ويكا ميت مستوم وكلتنا توم جيرو مالو listen now بإنجليش يقون أبكالك زي بتكرين ياخ قبر لكم
Committee on Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Africa will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the current state of United States policy towards Ethiopia. The chair would also remind our guests today that peaceful protest is welcome in this House. However, violence or verbal outbursts will not be tolerated, as they are violations of House rules. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. A little over 1 year ago, there was widespread attention on the situation in Ethiopia. A cessation of hostilities agreement was reached between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, bringing an end to the intense conflict. This hearing serves to examine the status of cessation of hostilities agreement implementation and more broadly the U.S.-Ethiopia bilateral relationship. A stable Ethiopia is good for the Horn of Africa and important to broader strategic U.S. interests in the region. However, I'm very concerned about Ethiopia's current trajectory and the direction of our policy. The high expectations that began in 2019, including awarding a Nobel Peace Prize to expand and deepen bilateral relationship with Ethiopia, can still be met. But recent challenges by leadership in Ethiopia and challenges including greater conflict in the region and global economic shocks have clouded Ethiopia's journey. In particular, the war in Tigray, current conflicts in Amhara and Oromia, direct comments regarding Ethiopia's so-called existential right to port access, and an increasing posture away from the United States has eroded some of the optimism in Ethiopia's democratic future and raised fundamental questions about Ethiopia's economic and long-term political stability. These conflicts and their aftershocks have exposed the deep divisions present in Ethiopian society. Eritrea's President Isaias Afwerki continues to undermine the cessation of hostilities agreement as his troops remain in Ethiopia, troops that have committed massacres, rapes, and other human rights violations and atrocities. Meanwhile, countries like China and the United Arab Emirates have established extensive economic ties with Ethiopia, ties that increasingly are moving into political and security space. Reports widely indicate that weapon systems provided by the UAE, among others, were a decisive factor in the Tigray conflict, and appears that Ethiopia is leading an increasingly rapid regional arms race. Additionally, just 3 months ago, the government of Ethiopia accepted an invitation into the BRICS country grouping. Economically, Ethiopia is struggling with unchecked inflation, a severe foreign currency shortage, and a sinking credit rating. Without support from international financial institutions, it's expected that Ethiopia is at risk of defaulting on its nearly $30 billion of external debt. In this, and seemingly only this, Ethiopia looks west for our money and is relying on International Monetary Fund staff-level agreement to stabilize its economy. The American taxpayers are tired of being used, and we hope to have some of our questions answered here today. Beyond the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, which represents a critical piece of infrastructure for Ethiopia to reach its developmental goals, it's really hard to see other areas of optimism. The United States has had to suspend life-saving humanitarian assistance for 5 months this year because the government of Ethiopia's complicity in a food aid diversion sham. Last week, negotiations with the Oromo Liberation Army once again did not conclude with an agreement, while the conflict in Amhara has not even reached the negotiating table and still simmers. Implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement in Tigray remains incomplete, and no justice has been served for those brutalized by what some have called the deadliest conflict in the 21st century so far. Last December, just 1 month after the cessation of hostility agreement was signed and 11 months after Ethiopia's AGOA eligibility was rescinded for gross violations of human rights, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was invited to Washington, D.C. to attend the Africa Leaders Summit. The hearing title is about the promise and the peril of U.S. policy toward Ethiopia. And if I'm being honest, it's increasingly difficult to see where the promise lies. I thank the witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimony. The chair now recognizes ranking member for a statement.
Thank you, Chair James and Ambassador Hammer, Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman. Thank you so much for testifying before the subcommittee today on the state of U.S. policy towards Ethiopia. Ambassador Hammer, it's great to see you again after welcoming you in San Diego this summer to host the Ethiopian Diaspora Peace Conference and hear the perspectives of different Ethiopian diaspora communities so we can work together towards peace for the country and region. I have to admit, I wish we were in San Diego right now. I am cold, but I'm glad to see you again to further that conversation. I'm so proud to represent San Diego, a community that has a long history of welcoming migrants and refugees, including Ethiopians, with open arms. And San Diego is just a small portion of the United States' strong Ethiopian diaspora, which encompasses hundreds of thousands of immigrants who have close familial, social, and economic ties to Ethiopia, and makes up the second largest African immigrant group in the United States. This hearing is very timely. It has been over 1 year since the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement in Pretoria between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, but we have continued to see ongoing human rights violations in Tigray and across the country, as well as spreading conflict in Amhara, Afar, and Oromia. The war in northern Ethiopia and ongoing conflict have triggered a massive refugee and displacement crisis, even setting a world record for displacements in a single year. We've also seen the disruption of crops and increase in food prices, causing millions in the country to rely on food aid, which was temporarily paused due to its diversion. I'm incredibly relieved that food assistance resumed earlier this month, and I commend USAID's work in securing important reforms to prevent diversion and ensure food reaches those in need. But it was clear when I traveled to Ethiopia in 2021, and it's even more clear today. Many challenges remain to create long-lasting peace, safety, and security. Following the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement, the focus must now be on implementing the rest of the agreement in a thoughtful way, pursuing a credible and inclusive transitional justice process that guarantees accountability for war crimes and ongoing human rights violations, and addressing long-held grievances across the country through an inclusive and transparent national dialogue process to prevent another large-scale war. The United States must also urge all parties to pursue peace processes to address ongoing conflict in Amhara and Oromia. Addressing these root causes from a long-term conflict prevention perspective should be central to U.S. policy toward Ethiopia. And this will require high-level attention and prioritization from the United States and the international community, including cooperation from key regional actors with broad influence like the UAE and Turkey. Ethiopia represents the future of the African continent and is the second most populous African country. It has the potential to be a stabilizing force for the region and across the continent. As it experiences high inflation and economic stressors since the war, it is now more important than ever to invest in Ethiopia's long-term stability, which must include real accountability and reconciliation among Ethiopians. It's a key national security priority for the United States to keep its attention on Ethiopia and do everything we can to help secure a more promising future for Ethiopians. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you all about prospects for long-term peace and stability and how the United States can be best positioned to support Ethiopians in this pursuit, which will be critical for the region and the broader continent. Thank you. I go back.
Thank you very much. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And echoing my ranking member sentiments, I'm very, very pleased to have you here today. The Honorable Mike Hammer is Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa, Bureau of African Affairs, U.S. Department of State. Tyler Beckelman is Deputy Assistant Administrator, Bureau for Africa, U.S. Agency for International Development. I thank you again each for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to please keep your spoken remarks to about 5 minutes, in order to allow for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Hammer for his opening statement. Good to see you again, sir.
Good to see you, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs. It is a pleasure to see you both again. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss U.S. policy and interests in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa with you and the distinguished members of the subcommittee, as well as other members who have come here today because of their interest in Ethiopia. I also want to recognize the Ethiopian diaspora, which is extremely active and which, of course, cares very deeply about events in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, as you have said, Mr. Chairman, is a strategically important country. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to working to promote peace, democracy, and economic development for the benefit of all Ethiopians, the broader region, as well as the American people. Our long-term goal is to support policies and reforms that will enable greater partnership between our two countries. During my tenure as Special Envoy, the administration has focused on bringing an end to conflicts in Ethiopia and reducing tensions around the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, otherwise known as GERD. Following the November 2022 cessation of hostilities agreement, the COHA, between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, we have been focused on the agreement's implementation while impressing upon the Ethiopian government the importance of dialogue and negotiation as a path to resolving ongoing violence in Oromia and Amhara. And we regularly engage with Ethiopian diaspora to explain U.S. policy, encourage civil discourse, and foster reconciliation among all ethnicities and regions. As we pursue these policies with our colleagues at USAID and the interagency, we absolutely prioritize our responsibility to U.S. taxpayers. In Pretoria, I was proud to represent the United States as an active observer in the African Union facilitated talks that led to the COHA. Within 48 hours of the signing of the COHA, it silenced the guns and ended a horrific 2-year war that killed hundreds of thousands and caused untold suffering, including from horrific mass sexual and gender-based violence. Since its signing, the United States has supported efforts to implement all aspects of the COHA, among them transitional justice, accountability, protection of civilians, and respect for human rights, including by funding of international human rights observers. As Secretary Blinken said during his visit this last March, to avoid future conflicts arising from past grievances, it is important, essential, to account for the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other human rights abuses and violations committed in the context of Ethiopia's conflicts. Shortly after his visit, the Secretary announced his determination that all sides had committed horrific atrocities in the northern conflict and that ensuring accountability will be a key element of our policy towards Ethiopia. As part of our commitment to accountability, the State Department has supported the work of the Transitional Justice Group Working Group of Experts, an independent body with a nationwide mandate. This working group held 60 consultations throughout Ethiopia to gather views from affected communities on the desire for justice, truth, reparations, and institutional reform. We look forward to the working group's recommendations, and we will work with the Ethiopian government, civil society, and the victims, including survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence, on their implementation and on the implementation of their recommendations. Over the last year, we have seen significant progress. For example, independent monitors have reported a dramatic decrease in human rights violations and abuses in Tigray. However, much more needs to be done. Eritrean forces have not fully withdrawn from Ethiopia. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR, of the Tigrayan forces is lagging, and the status of contested areas remains unresolved. Therefore, implementation of the COHA remains a work in progress. And we are deeply concerned about the ongoing violence in Amhara and Oromia. There have been credible reports of gross violations of human rights, significant loss of life, and severe economic disruption. We have urged all actors to refrain from violence and hate speech and to protect civilians, and we have offered to support or participate in mediation efforts. In fact, I returned this last week from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where the U.S. participated in talks between the Ethiopian government and the Oromo Liberation Army. We reiterated to all involved that there are no military solutions to the complex challenges posed by these situations. Compounding these challenges, Ethiopia is also confronting macroeconomic stresses. Foreign exchange reserves are at the lowest in 2 decades. Inflation has averaged over around 30% for the last 2 years. So the IMF is in discussions with the government of Ethiopia over concerns about the state of the economy. Regarding the GERD, we are encouraged that there are diplomatic negotiations underway between the parties, and the United States remains actively diplomatically engaged to support those parties in achieving an agreement that benefits Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, as well as the region writ large. In closing, let me reiterate my appreciation to this committee for your commitment and counsel. Rest assured that we are clear-eyed about the challenges in Ethiopia as we work to support an Ethiopia that is more peaceful and prosperous, one in which the United States and Ethiopia can benefit from a strong partnership. Thank you, and I look forward to your insights, recommendations, and to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. I now recognize Mr. Beckelman for his opening statement. Thank you, gentlemen, for your opening remarks. I now recognize myself for as many time as I may consume. In October 2023, Abiy publicly argued that Ethiopia, landlocked since Eritrea seceded in 93, must acquire a port
ብዛዕባ ናይ ኣፍ ደገ ባሕሪ ዝዛረብ ዘሎ listen up.
on the Red Sea to break its population out of a geographic prison, describing it as an existential issue. Further discussion around reopening direct Red Sea access, arguing that his request was based upon historical, geographical, ethnic, economic grounds, indicating that lack of access was a potential source of future conflict. Historical, geographical, ethnic, economic grounds. Does that sound familiar? Russia cultivated closer ties with Ethiopia during the Tigray conflict, which overlapped with its invasion of Ukraine. The more I learn about this, the more I'm growing concerned that the Ethiopian government is not interested in peace and is only interested in the West, the United States in particular, to solve its increasing financial woes. Can you help me parse through this? Number one question, gentlemen, whomever would like to answer first. When I hear a potential source of future conflict, is that a threat from the Ethiopian government?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have seen that the comments relating to port access have created concerns, not only for the United States, but also for other countries in the region. But I would also note that the Prime Minister has publicly said that efforts to gain access to a port will be done through commercial, peaceful means. And he has done his bit to provide public and private reassurances. Certainly, the last thing this region needs is another war. And we have been clear that from the perspective of the United States, what needs to happen both in the region and, but most importantly, internally inside Ethiopia, is to address conflicts and violence through peaceful dialogue. And we have demonstrated both through our work with the African Union in achieving the comprehensive COHA, as well as the cessation of hostilities agreement, as well as participating more recently in the talks on the OLA, that is our commitment. So that, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hammer, excuse the interruption. You just acknowledged also credible reports of gross violations of human rights in Amhara and Oromia. Does the department consider this, in addition to the past statements, regardless of how it may have been softened for Western ears? Does this constitute a pattern? And how much should we believe folks who are following in the footsteps of essentially Russia joining and aligning with BRICS?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we are deeply concerned and alarmed by the reports of extrajudicial killings, detentions that are and suffering that is being inflicted upon civilians in both Amhara and Oromia. We have made this clear to the government, Secretary Blinken, and numerous calls with the Prime Minister, as well as officials at all levels of the State Department.
Have we made it clear that concrete steps must be taken in the immediate future to rectify this? And are you satisfied with the progress they're making, sir?
Yes, sir. We have always in our conversations made clear that human rights is a core component of the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy, and that it matters in terms of how we view our bilateral relationship with Ethiopia. So we are continuously pressing for improvement. We are not satisfied, and those conversations will continue every day as needed until hopefully we see a cessation of all violations and abuses taking place.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. Mr. Beckelman, if you have a comment, next 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say, just very quickly, that we believe very firmly that it's in our interest, it's in the Ethiopian people's interest, and it's in the world's interest to prevent an economic collapse in Ethiopia and to see the Ethiopian people stand on their 2 feet. That's why we continue to support these processes and continue to support them in a way that we feel is consistent with our values and our interests in Ethiopia. And we'll continue to do that. With a population of 126 million people, over 40% of which are youth under the age of 15, we think it's absolutely incredible to continue to help Ethiopians stand on their 2 feet, and a stable and democratizing Ethiopia is ultimately in the best interest of the United States.
Totally agree with all this. Monkeying around the Ethiopian people are the ones who truly suffer. I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Ms. Sarah Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In September, I led a letter to Secretary Blinken and Ambassador Thomas Greenfield urging the United States to use its voice and influence to renew the mandate of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, ICRI. Unfortunately, ICRI's mandate was not renewed, ending the only independent investigative mechanism with the mandate to investigate abuses across all of Ethiopia. Ambassador Hammer, what specific steps did the U.S. government take in advocating for ICRI's renewal, and what plan is in place to ensure independent human rights monitoring continues?
Ranking Member, I appreciate and remember receiving your letter and appreciate your deep interest in continuing the ICRI mission, which we thought absolutely was critical and important. We worked to try to renew it in Geneva. Unfortunately, it was not renewed. However, in anticipating that perhaps there wouldn't be the support for its renewal, we, the United States, through our colleagues in USAID, provided funding for OHCHR monitors to be deployed in Tigray and other regions of Ethiopia. In fact, I've met with those monitors on my visits to Mekele this past year, and they have reported a dramatic decrease in human rights violations. So we are committed to ensuring that there is independent monitoring and that there is certainly investigations into past abuses and atrocities and war crimes that have been committed.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. On that note, according to a recent Harvard survey, more than 90% of Ethiopians believe it would be unacceptable to move forward without some sort of truth-seeking trials or reparations. But I think all of us who've worked in conflict know that transitional justice, how you do it is more complicated than it sounds. And the survey also found that residents of Tigray have little confidence in domestic courts to provide justice, but that a plurality of Ethiopians across the country favored using existing domestic courts to pursue accountability as opposed to some sort of hybrid or international mechanism. And obviously, like everything in Ethiopia, varied widely among regions. So navigating a credible transitional justice process will be challenging, but incredibly important. Ambassador Hammer, how does the United States intend to work with the government of Ethiopia to address structural challenges and political will to pursue an inclusive, transparent, and credible process that is conflict sensitive?
Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs. As I mentioned, when Secretary Blinken visited in March, he had direct conversations with the Prime Minister and senior members of his cabinet, as well as making public the United States' absolute commitment to seeing through Ethiopia. There absolutely must be a transitional justice system that
made when he was here for holding this hearing. I want to follow up on some of the chairman's line of questioning regarding as Prime Minister Abe increasingly orients his foreign policy decisions eastwards and continues to ignore basic benchmarks on justice and transparency. What in the last 3 years has indicated that Abe cares about his reputation in Washington? And as a follow-up, in what regards has Prime Minister Abe followed through on any other concessions or agreements made when he was here for the African Leaders Summit?
Thank you, Representative Kane. We have consistently had very direct and frank discussions with the Prime Minister as well as with his government on the expectations that the United States has for having a partnership that is beneficial to the American people and to Ethiopians. And as a part of that conversation, we have repeatedly urged that there be an improvement in the human rights situation. And again, at least as part of the COHA that was signed in November 2nd of 2022, we saw the government follow through on its commitments in allowing for an interim regional administration to be established in Tigray. We saw withdrawal of VNDF troops that has now led to a significant decrease in human rights abuses as recognized by independent monitors. And after months of urging, we have seen now an effort for dialogue with the Oromo Liberation Army, one in which we were invited as the United States, again, participated as an observer. So we believe that, again, U.S. engagement in order to promote stability, democracy in Ethiopia is essential to trying to put Ethiopia on the right path. And we will continue to pursue those efforts at every level, including when Prime Minister Abiy attended the African Leader Summit and had discussions with both our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken.
So what was it that you saw when you were there as an observer status in the negotiations? What's the timeline for resolution to some of these conflicts and the fighting in your point of view?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate the question. When I took this job in June of 2022, I was told that this horrific war in Tigray, in northern Ethiopia, would never end. That'd be disastrous. And it had already been horrific. And yet, through quiet diplomacy and working with the African Union, we were able to achieve a very significant peace. Now we're involved in talks with between the government and the OLA. It would be it would be difficult to say that we can yield the kind of result that we would like, everyone, that are the people of Oromia would like in short order. The talks were difficult. I spent 2.5 weeks in Dar es Salaam, but progress was made. But we are committed to trying to see a peaceful resolution to these conflicts, also in Amhara. If there is an opportunity, we will offer our good offices to help mediate, to help promote peaceful dialogue. We have been clear repeatedly, there are no military solutions to these complex, difficult, historical issues in Ethiopia. And I'm proud that the administration has made every effort consistently to try to advance peace, and we are committed to continuing these efforts and whenever the opportunity arises.
What, if I may,
Yes.
what do you think are the biggest limitations to negotiations succeeding?
Well, of course, it's not only just the government, but both parties need to be prepared to make compromises and, frankly, to have the courage to decide that violence is not the answer, that what is best for their interests and their people more broadly is to enter into a political dialogue that achieves some of their objectives. We have seen their efforts underway for a national dialogue, which we believe, if it is inclusive and credible, could be a very important step forward for overcoming some of these historic grievances and horrific and terrible ethnic tensions that are currently plaguing Ethiopia.
Thank you. My time has run out here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. The chair now recognizes Rep. Sherfield McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, along with my colleagues, are obviously pleased that this month marks 1 year since the cessation of the hostility agreement was signed, bringing an end to the horrific 2-year war in Tigray. During that horrific conflict, hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans were forcibly displaced from Western Tigray during the war, in what the State Department determined constituted an ethnic cleansing. My question is a follow-up to Rep. Jacobs. Is there any way the U.S. can assist Ethiopian authorities in prosecuting those responsible for crimes in Western Tigray?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We appreciate your interest and concern. We share the same concern that those responsible for these war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gross violations of human rights be held accountable. We are prepared, of course, to cooperate. It is currently the responsibility of both the government of Ethiopia and, in fact, the government of Eritrea, whose forces were also responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, to prosecute the individuals responsible. And we will continue to insist that they do.
My second question is, Ethiopia has historically been a major contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. It currently has 1,500 troops serving the United Nations mission in South Sudan. Now, my question for Ambassador is, how is the UN ensuring, through enhanced vetting, that the Ethiopian troops who committed gross human rights violations during the war are not serving in the UN peacekeeping missions?
That's a good question. And in fact, we demand through lengthy vetting in terms of any security cooperation that we might be involved in. And the UN, as you have indicated, has its own vetting procedures, which are absolutely necessary, again, as you said, to ensure that any troops or individuals who have been involved in human rights violations not participate in any UN peacekeeping mission.
And could you shed some light on some of the new vetting processes and practices?
The UN's, I would have to defer to their processes. Again, it's important that they are in place in terms of the thoroughness. I'm proud of the legislating that we do as the United States, and I would hope that they are equally thorough.
In late 2021, when the United States terminated Ethiopia's eligibility for AGOA benefits, the Biden administration provided the Ethiopian government with a set of benchmarks, many of which focused on the Tigray conflict, in order to regain its AGOA status. Ambassador Hammer, what is the administration's current assessment of Ethiopia's compliance with those benchmarks?
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, you're right. We provided some benchmarks, as you may know. The eligibility to AGOA is currently under review and will be determined in matter of weeks. But as the chairman and the ranking member, as all of you have said, there are grave concerns about continuing human rights violations in Ethiopia, specifically in Amhara and Oromia, and not to get in front of what will be decided by USTR and the White House, but those human rights concerns need to be addressed under the legal standards of AGOA.
And from your professional assessment of the eligibility requirements, what do you think about them?
Well, as a member of the administration, I don't have any personal thoughts.
Professional.
Yeah, no,
You're
professional. I mean,
professional.
of course. I mean, Congress passed AGOA and set some very clear and stringent guidelines that must be abided by. And therefore, that's what the administration does. We analyze the situation on the ground and see if, in fact, eligibility is available. And we constantly evaluate the situation. AGOA is beneficial to the United States, as well as obviously to the country that's seeking it. But there are certain standards that must be adhered to.
And with the information you have right now, do you believe that they'll meet the eligibility requirements?
Again, it's not just my decision alone. This is a very thorough interagency process led by our USTR. And I think that given what we've been discussing here at this hearing, it's fair to say that there are very serious remaining concerns given the reports of human rights violations occurring currently in both Oromia and Amhara.
Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
You're welcome.
The chair now recognizes Rep. Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Special Envoy Hammer, I want to thank you and start by commending your efforts to reach an agreement to bring the intense conflict to an to be an end about a year ago. But it's clear that the terms of the agreement have not been fully implemented, and it looks like the timeline for a peaceful resolution of those disputes in line with the Constitution remains still unidentified or undefined. Many human rights groups and experts, including the Simon Saljot Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, have been critical of the transitional justice process being conducted by the Ethiopian government. However, despite the skepticism, the State Department appears to be giving credence to this government-run process. So I want to ask you, who is the senior-most individual in the government of Ethiopia or among the Tigrayan political establishment to be held accountable for the human rights violations?
Thank you, Representative Kim. The process is ongoing. I know that we are impatient in terms of wanting to see that justice be done and that individuals be held accountable. I can assure you again, at all levels of our government, with the Ethiopian government and those responsible for developing their transitional justice process and ensuring that there's accountability, that we continue to press to make sure that it is a process in terms of transitional justice that is inclusive and that will be
Special
credible.
Envoy, does the Ethiopia's interministerial level task force still exist?
I believe it does. And again, there are internal Ethiopian processes underway. We provide advice and support to try to ensure, again, that it'll be a credible, inclusive
Does
transition.
that task force have jurisdiction over the Ministry of Defense?
I believe it. Well, I don't think so.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, what benchmarks is the administration using to determine whether the Ethiopian government's proposed transitional justice policies are in line with the international standards, including being victim-centered?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It needs to be victim-centered, and I'm sure my colleague from USAID, Tyler, can provide even further guidance in terms of the support that we're doing there. The white paper enunciating the government's policy has not come out yet. There have been discussions in the lead up to it. We have been providing advice. I attended one of the conferences with a group of international experts on transitional justice, where there were other experts from Africa, Europe, and Latin America. So I know that the government has been getting advice in terms of how it best should proceed in line with other international efforts that have produced credible, inclusive transitional justice.
Can you tell me who
processes.
has the accountability over the Ministry of Defense?
Well, the government of Ethiopia is responsible ultimately, and they'll have to ensure that members of their forces who have been involved in gross violations of human rights are held accountable.
You know, Chinese economic activists, activities and investments throughout Africa have been directly linked to environmental degradation and have created public health emergencies throughout the continent. For example, in 2014, the Somali Ogaden region of Ethiopia has seen thousands die from a mysterious disease in areas surrounding a Chinese government-linked natural gas plant that has poisoned the drinking water supply. I want to ask the question to both of you. How does the State Department plan to hold China accountable for the negative impact of China's investment in African and local communities?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that
Yeah.
one, Congresswoman. Thank you very much for your question. I think
elevating the underrated power of diplomacy. The last administration didn't understand that when it came to the continent. So I have a few questions. The first is, what do you think the impact of BRICS' recent expansion to include Ethiopia, and what should we be thinking about?
Thank you. It's good to see you again. I do have to report that my Trojan daughter, Brynja, graduated and is working in LA.
Great,
Yeah,
right
so,
on.
keep the Trojan connection. Well, on the BRICS, we as the administration see that the majority of countries want a stable and open and prosperous and secure world. They respect sovereignty and territorial integrity and promotes shared responsibility and enables cooperation on shared challenges. We have no interest in dividing the world into rigid blocks. The United States will continue to work closely with our partners, including those that are members of BRICS. And so, yes, we've seen that Ethiopia is going to join the group. It's a motley of countries that don't seem to share much in common. So from the U.S. perspective, we want to, again, stand by our values, our market economy, the key components that have helped in development and have helped countries progress. And we remain, I think, a very attractive partner to countries around the world, including Ethiopia.
Thank you for that. I think they do share a skepticism for the West. And I asked the question because I do have concerns about Somalia and contentions around maritime routes. I will go to my next question. I've been concerned to hear reports of escalating hostilities in Ethiopia, particularly in Amhara, between the Fano militias and the Ethiopian National Defense Force. So has the State Department been engaging with the government on ways to bring an end to this violence?
Yes, and in fact, we have. I was in Addis last week, met with the Prime Minister and some of his senior advisors, and we continue to impress upon them that we do not see a military solution to the conflict in Amhara, that we believe that the best way forward would be to start some type of dialogue. And of course, we have repeatedly urged all parties to refrain from hurting and inflicting horrific acts on civilians. So there's an absolute need to protect civilians, to stay away from ethnic hatred. And the United States is prepared again to offer our good offices, our diplomatic efforts to try to again bring some level of peace to that region, so that those problems can be addressed through dialogue rather than conflict.
Great. Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman, I'd love to get your voice on the record. So recent studies suggest that more than 100,000 women may have been the victim of conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray during the 2-year civil war. So what is the level of need of victims of this conflict-related sexual violence? And what has USAID, how have they been serving in this space?
Clearly, you acknowledged
investments, and we're going to continue to try and make sure that women who are affected get the services that they desperately need.
Thank you for that. Apologies for the time going over, Mr. Chair. I just want to say I think it is the frailty of men that cause them to harm women. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to a question that I don't believe was answered. Ambassador Hammer, if you could state for me clearly, you acknowledged credible reports of gross violations of human rights in Amhara and Oromia. Does the department consider that a pattern? Yes or no?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As of yet, we do not, but we are constantly reviewing the facts on the ground, and we know the implications of making such an assessment and determination in terms of whether it's a consistent pattern or pattern of gross violations of human rights.
እዚኣ ሕቶ እዚኣ ብጣዕሚ ኣገዳሲት እያ ብካልእ ብሰፊሑ ክገልፀልኩም እየ ኣብ ትግራይ እንድሕሪ ዓመፅ ተፈፂሙ ኢልና ኣብ ኣምሓራ ከይጋጥም ኣሎ ኣብ ኦሮሞ ተመሳሳልነት ኣለዎ ዶ ኢሉ ካልኣይ ግዜ እዩ ዝሓቶ ዘሎ ግን ኣየ ተመሳሳልነት የብሉን ኢሉ ኣለዎ እዚኣ ከዓ ምስ ናይ ኤርትራ ከተሓዝዋ ስለ ዝደልዮም ድሓን ንቐፅል
Thank you, and I recognize Rep. Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I represent a diverse district in Colorado with a vibrant Ethiopian diaspora community. For this community, these challenges that we're discussing today are tangible, lived reality. They have loved ones who have been affected by conflict, killed, displaced, and extreme economic stressors, by droughts and floods, and by ongoing challenges that have shaped and distorted their way of life over many years. I meet with these communities to hear about their concerns, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss a few of them today. So first, in signing the cessation of hostilities agreement, federal officials committed to restoring basic services and expediting aid. But I still hear from constituents about their inability to access basic necessities. To Deputy Assistant Administrator Beckelman, how has the U.S. pushed the Ethiopian government on the issue of addressing outstanding access issues in Tigray? And can you speak to the Ethiopian government, how they've taken steps to abide by the cessation agreement and make improvements? And also, similarly, along the same vein, I've heard a lot of concerns about human rights violations and civilian harm in Amhara as well, and a lot of issues there. So a state of emergency and other limitations have reduced access to the area and make it very difficult to understand what is occurring on the ground in real time. So to Ambassador Hammer, how is the United States monitoring reported violations and engaging with the Ethiopian government to pursue a peaceful resolution in the Amhara region as well?
Thank you, Congressman, very much for your question. Let me just say the access picture for humanitarian organizations, USAID partners, and others is still decidedly mixed. We saw after the Koha a tremendous increase in access to parts of Tigray that silenced the guns, and we took full advantage of those opportunities to surge our assistance and services into those locations. In other places, access continues to sort of track around the areas that are experiencing insecurity. So in parts of Amhara and Oromia now, it is still very difficult and very dangerous for humanitarians to work there. They continue to face persistent threats on the ground, and they continue to have to make day-to-day decisions about their security and their ability to deliver services in those locations. We continue to insist and continue to push for full access across the board for all of our implementing partners. But really, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, and it still remains.
We, as the United States, care about all Ethiopians and certainly will denounce violations of human rights against any individual, irrespective of ethnicity. In terms of the situation in Amhara, we have had discussions and urged the government to lift the state of emergency, to allow access to media, to allow access to the internet, and to enable there to be clear ability to understand what the situation in Amhara currently is. We also have urged the government to find a way forward through dialogue and peaceful discussion to address some of the very difficult historic issues that affect people in Amhara and that are currently the reason for the fighting. We have been clear that there are no military solutions to this conflict, and we hope that, like the government has in the past, that perhaps the United States might be able to help resolve these issues by offering our good offices and our expertise in terms of trying to move forward in a way that ends the violence.
Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the outreach to the diaspora community as well. I mean, I represent all of those groups, Tigrays, Amaras, Oromos, and it's very clear that the only pathway to peace will be if all of those groups have.
That's 40 times the number of deaths for having this hearing. Thank you for allowing me to participate, although I'm not a member of the subcommittee. This conflict lasted 2 years. 500,000 people died. That's 40 times the number of deaths in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since October 7th. It is outrageous that this conflict has not gotten more attention in the world. That is not a problem caused by our witnesses here. They're working on it every day. And Gaza is unparalleled. No, what's unparalleled is what happened in northern Ethiopia. We have a number of others in the human rights community who have very falsely said that what is happening in Gaza is massively larger than anything that has happened since 2019. No, it is what we're here to talk about today. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing.